If you hear your name whispered in the halls of Waverly, run. Don't turn around. Don't stop. Just run. This was the last thing Scott Matthews, a documentary filmmaker, heard from a former nurse before she abruptly hung up the call. At first, he dismissed it as paranoia, but as he stood before the towering ruins of Waverly Hills Sanatorium, a cold breath of air brushed against his ear, and he swore he heard a voice whisper, "Scott!" Was it the wind, or was something already watching him from the darkness inside? Scott had always been a skeptic. Ghost stories were nothing more than exaggerated myths created to feed on people's fears. But Waverly Hills was different. It was personal. His younger sister, Emily, had vanished 2 years ago after sneaking into the abandoned sanatorium with her friends. While others made it out, Emily was never found. The police ruled it as a missing persons case, but Scott knew there was more to the story. Now standing in front of the decaying hospital, armed with only a flashlight and his camera, he had one mission: to find out what really happened to Emily. As he stepped into the building, the air changed. It was thick, suffocating, as if unseen hands pressed against his chest. The hallway stretched unnaturally long, and every door seemed slightly ajar, as if something had just slipped inside moments before he arrived. Then he saw it. Down the corridor in the dim glow of his flashlight stood a woman. Her back was turned, her hospital gown stained with something dark. At first, Scott thought she was a lost squatter, but then he noticed something wrong. Her feet weren't touching the ground. Before he could react, her head snapped toward him at an unnatural angle. The hollow sockets where her eyes should have been seemed to stare through him. Then, in a voice that sent ice through his veins, she whispered, "She's still here, Scott, but she's not your sister anymore." The lights flickered violently, and in the brief moment of darkness, she was suddenly right in front of him, her decayed fingers reaching for his throat. Scott scrambled back, his breath ragged. He ran down the hall, heart pounding in his ears. But as he turned a corner, he froze. There on the floor was Emily's backpack, untouched, covered in dust. His hands trembled as he picked it up, flipping it open. Inside was a notebook, her diary. He flipped to the last page, his vision blurring as he read her final entry. "I hear them whispering. They know my name. They won't let me leave. If you find this, Scott, I love you. Please don't look for me. You won't make it out." Tears burned his eyes. His sister had been alive, trapped in this place. And now he was too. A chilling wind swept through the hall, and the walls groaned, as if something inside was waking up. The doors slammed shut one by one, forcing Scott to move forward. He turned a corner and gasped. There in the darkness were dozens of figures, shadowy, skeletal, their hollow eyes locked onto him. And among them, Emily. But something was wrong. Her skin was pale, her lips blue, and her eyes empty. She tilted her head, her voice a haunting echo. "Scott, why did you come?" He staggered back. This wasn't Emily. It couldn't be. Then the shadows moved, and with horrifying realization, Scott saw what they truly were. They weren't ghosts. They were trapped souls, stitched together by something far more sinister. And now they had a new victim. The walls whispered. The air shifted. A cold hand suddenly clamped over Scott's mouth from behind. A voice hissed in his ear, low and inhuman. "She's not your sister anymore, but you can still save her if you dare go deeper." The lights cut out, and in the darkness, something began to crawl toward him. Scott could hear it, something breathing in the darkness. Slow, heavy, unnatural. It wasn't human. It wasn't alive. He couldn't move. Cold, decayed fingers pressed against his lips, silencing his scream. The voice that whispered in his ear was neither male nor female. It was something ancient, something that had never left Waverly Hills. "If you run, you'll never see your sister again." His pulse pounded. Emily, if she was really here, he couldn't leave. He wouldn't leave. But the thing behind him, it wasn't going to let him go so easily. Scott was 8 when Emily was born. He remembered the first time she gripped his finger with her tiny hands, the way she used to follow him everywhere, looking up to him like he was her hero. But he had failed her. 2 years ago when she went missing, He had searched day and night, screamed her name until his voice was raw. He had begged the police, pleaded with reporters. No one believed she was still out there. But he knew. And now, here he was, standing in the decayed ruins of Waverly Hills, her diary clenched in his trembling hands, reading her final words. "Please don't look for me. You won't make it out." He had promised to protect her, and now he was walking straight into the place where she had disappeared. A sudden noise. Click, click, click. Scott turned his flashlight towards the hallway. At first it looked empty, but then movement. A woman stood at the end of the corridor, facing the wall. She wore a hospital gown stained with something dark. Her long black hair clung to her face, hiding her features. The clicking sound came again. She was slamming her head against the wall, hard, over and over. Scott's breath caught in his throat. He stepped back, and the floor creaked beneath his feet. The woman froze. Slowly, her head twisted unnaturally to the side, too far, almost breaking, until she was facing him. Then she whispered, "You shouldn't be here." The lights flickered, and in that split second of darkness, she moved. A hand shot out of the shadows, gripping his ankle. Cold, bony, not human. Something dragged him backward into the dark. Scott hit the floor hard, his flashlight skidding away. He clawed at the ground, kicking, gasping for breath. And then he heard her voice. "Scott?" His blood ran cold. "Emily." He turned, his eyes adjusting to the dim light. There she was. She sat curled in a corner, wearing the same hoodie she had the night she disappeared. Her hair was messy, her face pale, her wrist bruised. Tears blurred his vision. "Emily!" He scrambled toward her, reaching out. But when she looked up, something was wrong. Her eyes were hollow. "Emily," he whispered, "it's me. It's your brother." She smiled, too wide, too unnatural. "Scott, I missed you." Then she started crawling toward him, fast. Scott screamed, scrambling backward. Emily's face shifted. Her skin cracked, her limbs bent at impossible angles. The thing wearing her face wasn't human. And behind her, they were coming. Dozens of figures, their bodies twisted, their mouths stretching open in silent screams. Their hollow eyes locked onto Scott. He grabbed his flashlight, flicking it back on. The figures vanished. Silence. Only one person remained. A doctor. Dressed in an old blood-stained lab coat, he stood in the doorway. His expression was calm, almost amused. "You shouldn't have come," the doctor said, tilting his head. "She belongs to us now." The shadows behind him moved. Hands reached out, twisted arms, clawed fingers, reaching for Scott. He turned to run, but the door behind him slammed shut. And then the doctor whispered, "Let's begin the treatment." Scott was trapped. The doctor stepped closer, pulling out something from his pocket, a rusted scalpel. "You came for your sister?" the doctor murmured. "Then you must take her place." The shadows lunged. The last thing Scott saw before the lights went out, Emily, standing at the end of the hall, watching and smiling. They never stopped the experiments. They just ran out of living subjects. Scott's vision blurred as the shadows closed in. The doctor loomed over him, scalpel gleaming in the dim light. The air was thick with decay, with whispers from the unseen, with something ancient and evil that didn't want him to leave. "You came for your sister," the doctor whispered, pressing the cold blade against Scott's throat. "Then you will take her place." The walls moaned, the floor trembled, and then a voice, a soft, familiar voice. "Scott, don't be afraid." Emily, but Emily was gone. Or worse, she was one of them now. Scott's hands trembled as he looked at his sister. Her body was pale, her eyes lifeless, her wrists bruised from the unseen chains of this place. He had spent 2 years searching for her, clinging to the hope that she was still alive, that he could save her. But looking into her hollow eyes now, he knew the truth. Emily wasn't Emily anymore. Tears burned his eyes. "I'm sorry," he whispered. The doctor smiled. "It's time." The shadows lunged, and then A blinding light exploded through the room. The screams of the dead filled the air as the darkness shrank back. Someone was fighting back. Scott gasped as the light engulfed him, searing through the shadows like fire. The doctor shrieked, stumbling backward, his flesh melting away like wax. And then, from within the brightness, Scott saw her. Emily. But this time, she wasn't the broken girl from before. She was whole. Her skin was no longer pale, her eyes no longer hollow. She stood in the golden light, radiant, untouchable, her expression both sorrowful and loving. "You have to leave, Scott," she said softly. "This place isn't meant for the living." The walls cracked, the ceiling rumbled, the sanatorium was collapsing, but Scott couldn't move. "I won't leave without you," he shouted. Emily shook her head, stepping closer. "You have to." Behind her, the shadows screamed, writhing, retreating. The doctor's skeletal remains crumbled to dust. The sanatorium was dying, and it was taking everything with it. Tears streamed down Scott's face. He had come so far, fought so hard, and now he had to say goodbye. Emily reached out, brushing a hand against his cheek. She felt warm, real. "You were the best big brother," she whispered. "You tried to save me, but now you have to save yourself." Scott choked on a sob. "Emily, please." Her fingers slipped away. "Tell Mom and Dad I love them." The light around her flared, swallowing the room. Scott felt himself being pulled back. The last thing he saw was Emily's smile as the sanatorium collapsed into darkness. Scott woke up outside. The ruins of Waverly Hills loomed behind him, silent and undisturbed, as if nothing had happened. The air was cold. The night was still. He was alive. But Emily was gone. Or so he thought. A movement caught his eye. On the ground beside him, Emily's diary. He picked it up with trembling hands, flipping to the last page. The words were different now. "You freed us. We are at peace. Don't come back." And at the bottom, one final message scribbled in shaky handwriting. "I love you, Scott." His breath caught. His heart ached. She was really gone. But this time she wasn't lost. She was free. Scott never returned to Waverly Hills. The world moved on, the sanatorium fading into another forgotten horror story, but he never forgot the lesson it had taught him. Some ghosts don't haunt us because they want revenge. Some haunt us because we refuse to let go. Scott had spent 2 years chasing a past he couldn't change, and in doing so, he had nearly lost himself. In the end, saving Emily had never been about bringing her back. It was about letting her go. And as he walked away from the ruins, diary in hand, he knew some doors are meant to stay closed. Would you like a longer, expanded version of this final episode with more horror sequences, deeper emotions, and a stronger connection between Scott and Emily's journey?